We will hear argument this morning in case 2512.
Grievances we could go into with this system. I think we could be here for hours.
National Collegiate Athletic Association.
I think we have some proof, even a few years into NIL now, that people care about the logo.
There are too many people in power who have no desire to give up that power.
The NCAA's ever-shifting decisions, not stable decisions.
Does the concept of amateurism in college athletics even matter anymore?
They've capped it again without any sort of collective bargaining.
We'll finish with our unilateral decision.
Welcome back to another episode of Unilateral Decisions. Dominic Sheldon, our host, is still out playing softball, so I'm filling in. I'm not very good at this. But people are saying this is a great new podcast with sharp legal minds, and they pluralize that, which is hilarious because we have Sam over here. He is the sharp legal mind. Today, we will talk about eligibility. We're going to talk about transfer, and then we're going to get into some tennis. So I think right out of the gate, we'll start with the ghost transfer rule. We glossed over that last week, but I think it's an important enough topic that we should probably dive into a little bit, Sam.
Yeah, it's definitely something we mentioned last week, and we talked about last week in the context of collective bargaining, in the context of this is something that, would be eligible for collective bargaining, would be something that would certainly be on the table for collective bargaining. It's something that I imagine that a hypothetical players union for college athletes would really push back against pretty heavily. Kind of the combination between not only the ghost transfer rule, which I think a lot of people look at and they say, okay, this is a good thing to have. It's good to have one kind of transfer portal window. And to not allow, athletes to transfer outside of that window. A situation like Xavier Lucas from a couple years ago where, he was a defensive back at Wisconsin, and after the transfer portal ended, allegedly due to some tampering by Miami, decided I'm going to transfer from Miami. Wisconsin said, we're not going to enter you in the portal because, we don't, because you're outside the transfer portal and we don't have any obligations. And the NCAA said, well, actually, there's nothing really to stop you from just transferring because you can just disenroll at one school and then re-enroll at another school, and that's that. So that's exactly what he did. And now the NCAA has this rule where if you have that kind of ghost transferring, if you have that kind of situation where a player transfers outside of the transfer portal window, and this is a situation obviously intended to cut down on tampering, cut down on, kind of really restrict the access of players to be able to transfer. I don't know exactly what the punishment are. I remember there's a pretty heavy fine. There's suspension for the coach that ends up taking that player. Just a lot of penalties designed to again cut this down.
Yeah, they essentially took the path of not penalizing the athlete directly, right? We've seen that play out.
Yeah,
but now they've chosen to basically just neuter the whole situation and have a chilling effect by, theoretically penalizing the people who they do have control over, the coaches and the schools. And this idea of we're going to see it challenged, obviously.
Oh, yeah.
I think we're going to see it very soon. I think that there are enough situations going on in college football, and there's just enough powerful programs who are not going to go into the season with the prospect of not having someone they think is going to keep them competitive, especially at a premium position. And I don't know when that shoe's going to drop. I don't know who the first is going to be to challenge it. But it seems like just kind of the latest sort of like landmine that's been thrown out there that will ultimately not really hold up anywhere. But I'm curious to know, how does it compare to some of the other things that have been challenged? Because they did, not necessarily penalize the player. That's not how it's set up. I think they did that very intentionally. But it has a chilling effect on the transfer movement, kind of ability. So how does it get challenged? On what grounds does it get challenged? And what do you think that looks like?
Yeah, and and I think the first thing to point out is from the perspective of antitrust law, our favorite two words on this podcast,
and collective bargaining.
Two more of our favorite words. But from the perspective of antitrust law, it does not matter whether you are directly punishing the athlete or you're punishing the schools and the coaches. Really, what matters here ultimately is: are you restraining the market? Are you restraining the ability here? And there's a direct parallel here. You look back at the 1970s, and you look back at what we had, the Roselle rule. I brought this up in the context last week as well. You had a challenge to it, Mackey v. NCAA, where the court said, well, for one, this is outside the context of the collective bargaining agreement, so it is an antitrust, viable. And for two, this is a situation where the Roselle rule was designed to cut down on free agency, to cut down on players being able to move from one team to another, which sounds awfully familiar. And they did so by saying, well, if you're going to sign a restricted free agent, you're going to have to give the other team a player or cash in compensation to compensate them for the player that they're losing. And teams said, well, wait a minute, I don't want to give my rival a player or cash. I'm just not going to sign this guy. And it really led to, exactly as you pointed out, a chilling effect on free agency. It led to a lot of players being unsigned or being, kind of, I wouldn't say forced back is the right phrasing, but much more incentivized to, or much less incentivized to be able to move on to teams because other teams would not want them or would not want to pay them as much because they'd have to say, well, we're going to pay you this, this much less than we would have paid you originally because we have to compensate for the fact that we're also going to have to pay your old team for your services as well. And court stepped in and said, absolutely not. This is a clear antitrust violation. It's a restriction on the market. The effects are clear, and the effects are exactly what you're going for here, which is to have this chilling effect on the market. So it is a direct parallel, one where we have very clear precedent on it. And again, another situation where the NFL was not punishing directly the players. They weren't saying, if you leave, you have to pay this amount of money, or if you leave, you have to, do this certain thing, sit out a year or something like that, as we used to have. It is punishing the teams that sign them, and that same thing we're seeing with the ghost transfer rule.
So with precedent, this will get challenged, and it's going to go away.
Absolutely. Yeah, and maybe there's, maybe a court these days would say that, well, it's actually more necessary now, or it's actually something, but given the context of every other antitrust challenge we've seen against the NCAA, I think that would be a very tall order for the NCAA to defend. And I think they're doing all this because they feel, whether rightfully or not, that they're going to get some kind of antitrust relief in the near future.
Yeah, it goes back to a little bit. We talked, we had talked about the tampering in one of our previous episodes, and I think this ties in very closely with that. My commentary during the tampering episode was that, Sunshine will kind of eradicate some of these nefarious activities, and this is doing the opposite.
Yeah.
It's creating more dark corners by eliminating the different times a year that transfers could happen. And so what I guess I'm trying to understand, what is a possible solution? You brought up the example of restricted free agency, which still does exist in some sports leagues, pro leagues. Obviously, there's the collective bargaining element of why the rules are in place. But it sounds like in that example with the NFL, that didn't necessarily matter. But there's obviously ways to do it. Is there a way to get there? Is there a way? Let's just pretend that the players are involved and that everybody's on the same page. What would a reasonable sort of restricted sort of middle ground of being able to say, like, you could transfer, but you have to, meet these requirements? Like, I think the NBA, correct me if I'm wrong, restricted free agency is more or less the player on the team that they're currently on at least has first right of refusal to match an offer or something to that effect. Is there a world where we could get to something like that is enforceable? Again, assuming the players agree to it.
Sure. I mean, two quick clarifications just up front. One, the NBA, example obviously is product of collective bargaining. The NFL's current restricted free agency is a product of collective bargaining. Even if it looks very similar to what was challenged in the Mackey case, it's a draft pick instead of a player and or cash, but it's the same kind of principle. And for the Mackey situation, it's not that collective bargaining didn't matter in that instance. It's just that the court said, this does not reach through the product of arm's length bargaining was something that was unilaterally imposed by the NFL. So it's outside the context of the collective bargaining agreement. So one of those weird kind of situations where they did have collective bargaining, but this wasn't part of the collective bargaining agreement. So who knows? I mean, there's a whole kind of discussion we had about whether that ruling in regards to the collective bargaining piece of it holds up, but the antitrust piece certainly does hold up and would really kind of go after, or really kind of be a major thorn on the side for the NCAA to try to defend this if and when it's going to be challenged under antitrust law. And especially since you also have, and one thing we haven't mentioned yet, but we did mention last week was kind of the addition to this, Mitt Winter pointed this out on Twitter, the idea that now schools can say, if they have in their contracts that, it's a multi-year deal and we're not going to enter you in the transfer portal in the middle of that multi-year deal. The NCAA is now saying you don't actually have to enter them in transfer portal. The old rule was, you had to always enter athletes into the transfer portal if they requested it. Now that's apparently not the case, which is going to add a lot more fuel to that fire because it's something where it allows for more ghost transfers because athletes who, even if they're in the middle of that transfer portal season, even if the timing is right, if their contract says, we're not going to enter you, then they can't be entered. But, I know I just danced around your question without really answering it, but I think that actually does answer your question because you can have situations, you can have things that are individually done by contract. And if it's not a situation where the NCAA, if you didn't have this ghost transfer rule and you just had what Mitt pointed out, this idea that you don't have to enter them into the transfer portal, that might work. Where instead of punishing the team that signs the player, you're just collecting damages from that team. You're filing a lawsuit against them. You're doing exactly what we're currently seeing with the University of Cincinnati and Brendan Sorsby, where Cincinnati is suing Sorsby saying, you agreed via contract. If you breached this contract, you were going to pay us $1 million. Where's that $1 million? That is potentially doable. I mean, there's contractual questions. There's the big unanswered question about whether you can actually enforce pay-for-play damages on a explicitly non-pay-for-play contract. But that would be the way to do it without collective bargaining because the issue with antitrust law is not the restriction necessarily, it's the market-wide restriction. It's all the schools coming together and saying, we are going to collectively do this instead of individually doing it, where if it's individual, then the player could say, well, I'm not going to sign with you because you have this restriction. I'm going to go sign with this other guy who's not offering or is not requesting this restriction.
That's kind of what I expect to see across the board.
Sure.
I mean, I don't know why it's not at 100% yet. Like, is it strictly Mike, I'll probably ask you, is it strictly recruiting? I mean, if you are going to spend the money to recruit, develop, like, you have to protect your investment in some capacity. And if you now have the ability to say, we're going to sign you to, a 4 or 5 year deal, and there's going to be escalation. Yes, you'll have an opportunity to renegotiate, but you're going to be under contract. And if you leave, this is what's going to happen. Like, I don't know why we haven't seen more of that.
Honestly, I think there's still just so much confusion in the market about what can and can't be contracted. And I get it because, for so long when we were still at the university and the rules were going left, right, and center about, what could be contracted, where the school could be involved, where the school couldn't be involved. And even now when the contracts are, again, allegedly for NIL rights and not for pay to play, I still think there's some confusion around, can I contract you? Can I make it a requirement of the contract to say that you have to enroll at our school? Because for so long, that was like a taboo thing. You couldn't give anybody any money under the grounds that they were going to be at a specific school or in a specific market even, or some of those different things. And I just think that there's obviously schools doing that, whether that's the exact language of the contract or not. And I believe that it's permissible, but I don't think there's great education or clarity around whether or not that explicit language is permissible. And if that specific language would clear, any sort of review, and if a different compliance department would interpret it differently than another one, and if the conference interprets it differently. And I think there's a lot of confusion in that area specifically. That's a lot of the feedback I'm getting when we bring up examples or we bring up ideas of, well, how could this be done? How's that school doing this and I can't do this? And that example comes up more often than not of like, well, what are you requiring of the athlete in exchange for your rev share contract with them? And there's not clarity. There is not a one size fits all answer on that. I think that's a huge part of the issue right now, because I think if you're able to say by virtue of signing this contract that is a 3-year deal, you are, one of the terms of the agreement is that you're going to be enrolled at this university for those 3 years. I think a lot of things become a little bit easier to worry about on the contract standpoint, because now you're not trying to enforce the fact that you got tampered with or that somebody else, you enrolled somewhere else or a coach talked to you. That has nothing to do with it. It's cut and dry. Whether you're not enrolled here anymore, that's a breach of contract. And I think that would clear up 90% of the stuff around this and make a lot more people comfortable with that type of contract. And I think it's a pretty easy fix, to be honest. But the fact that it hasn't been fixed and hasn't just been universally clarified also leads me to believe that maybe it's not as cut and dry as I think that it is. Maybe it's actually not permissible, because I feel like that's a really easy answer to give if, in fact, the intention of the most recent rulings and the House settlement and everything else, if the intention was, yes, you can now, these can now be contingent upon enrollment at a specific university, then I think that cleans up a ton of stuff. But it's very clear within the market that that is not an answer that everyone feels like they interpret the same way.
Yeah, and I think there's two big reasons for that. I think one is they're still clinging, the NCAA to a certain extent is still clinging to the idea of amateurism, which I think we all kind of know at this point is at certain levels certainly still exists, but at the levels that we're really kind of talking about when we're talking about these contracts in general, is not a thing anymore. But it's something the NCAA that's still kind of very much rooted, within the NCAA's kind of apparatus, governance apparatus, and something where until there's a drastic overhaul of the NCAA rules, it's still going to be something that's always kind of lurking in the background and always kind of touching certain decisions where it's like, we need to keep this kind of an amateurish environment, even if it's a situation where we are directly paying players for their participation in a school, even if we're not calling it that. Second reason, of course, is, the employment question, where the more control you have over an athlete, the more susceptible you are to a challenge saying that they're employees. I could argue that we are already past that limit where, it doesn't matter what you call the contract, because of course, they're going to interpret it to be an employment contract anyway. But, I think that goes to the education part of it. And also the simple fact that we haven't had that ruling yet, where, the Johnson case is still very much working its way through the courts. And even though we have, the lower court decision and the Third Circuit decision saying on a motion to dismiss standard, yes, they're, if you look at the situation here, it's very plausible that they are employees. We don't have a firm ruling yet saying after discovery, yes, they are clearly employees. It's all kind of within the realm of plausible right now. And Joe, to your question, I think there's a really I think there actually is a pretty simple explanation for why we don't have these contracts yet, why schools are, still very hesitant about enforcing these contracts, these individual contracts with buyouts. It's a lot easier to have a bad guy. It's a lot easier to point to the NCAA and saying, we're not allowed to do, or we're not allowed to sign you because the NCAA won't let us, instead of saying, we're not going to sign you because we don't want to pay this buyout because, or for whatever reason like that. The NCAA, like at the end of the day, we talk about the NCAA as being something that is, kind of this overseeing entity that the schools all have to kind of tiptoe around. And to a certain extent, practically that's true. But the NCAA is the schools. The NCAA is doing the ghost transfer rule. They're doing all these restrictions because the schools want them to. And the reason why the schools want them to is it's a lot easier to have an overseeing entity that's telling you, you can do these certain things, you can't do these certain things. You're going to have to pay this by, you're going to have to, take these penalties for signing a ghost transfer, rather than having it done through individual litigation. And especially individual litigation where you pointed out recruiting, that's a big part of this as well, where, I'm sure there's a lot of recruits out there who are looking at what's going on with the University of Cincinnati and saying, I don't know if I necessarily want to sign a contract there, because if something goes wrong and I want to leave in the middle of a multi-year contract, they're going to sue me. Like I don't know if athletes are necessarily thinking that far ahead, but it wouldn't be surprising if some of them are, if some of their agents are.
But there's a workaround there. Instead of putting it on the kid in the contract to get, financial reimbursement if you leave, you could put it on the other school. Like, we're going to sign you to a 3-year deal. And if you leave before that 3-year deal is come to term, your next school is going to reimburse us, whatever we've invested, in you from, development, financially, all of it. You just put that on the school the kid's transferring to.
There's no privity of contract there. There's privity of contract being like they're a party to the contract. Like, obviously you're not necessarily looking ahead to the next school. You're not saying, well, I know I'm going to spend a year at Cincinnati before transferring to Texas Tech. So, Texas Tech's part of this deal. Like, they already know where they're going to sign me next year. So, we can obligate them. You can't really have a contract that says your next school is going to pay this, because the next school is going to look at that and say, well, we're not party to this contract. You don't have no power to bind us in this contract. So maybe it's something where you're expecting the player to pay it, and the player is going to go to the team and say, you have to pay this, but that's a separate negotiation. That's a separate contract.
So you couldn't, if I'm school B, it doesn't matter who you are, and I want this kid, even if he's got a contract with another school, to break that contract, there's nothing that would hold that school to paying a buyout.
No.
Within the scope of that contract.
Unless you have it through kind of an overseeing governing body. Like, I think what you're pointing out is directly parallel. And I think there's probably a lot of people listening to this right now are saying, well, wait a minute, that's what FIFA does. That's exactly what happens in European soccer and a lot of soccer, where you're paying a transfer fee. The problem is, well, there's two big problems with that. One is that FIFA just lost a major antitrust lawsuit about that. So that was a couple years ago. So yeah, no, it's a similar parallel, for maybe not for the reasons that the NCAA would want. But also it's because FIFA is instituting these penalties, because I don't know if it's necessarily FIFA itself, but I'm not that much of an expert on kind of, international sports, but it is an overseeing entity that's instituting that. It's not kind of through the player's contract necessarily, or exclusively.
I guess where I'm going, if the NCAA can implement the ghost transfer rule and they can put parameters on things, why could the NCAA not say schools are allowed to put these terms in their contracts? And if you bring a kid in before his contract is up and he's got a buyout in there, you have to pay that. Why are they able to do the ghost transfer but not that?
Well, there's an assumption that you're making is that they're able to do the ghost transfer.
Right now, they think they can.
Well, they think they can. We'll see what happens. And if they're right, then maybe you can extend that to a certain degree. I think it depends on how a court looks at it. And I think we're all talking about hypotheticals. Like, I can't sit here and say, especially after all the eligibility lawsuits, and after we've seen with a lot of these lawsuits where the courts of appeals in the Furcuri case and the Robinson case and the Bram case and the Martinson case, and I know I'm forgetting one in there, but we'll just leave it there because, the ELAD case, of course, in the Third Circuit, where these courts have been very kind of non-committal about whether the eligibility rules are, in fact, antitrust violations. They've said we just need more evidence at this point. We're speaking kind of in the hypotheticals. I'm looking towards the Ohio case, which might be decided differently these days. I'm looking at the Tennessee case, which might be decided differently these days just because the market has shifted. We're speaking in hypotheticals about whether it's an antitrust violation or not. I know, however, it will definitely be challenged, and because of the Alston decision, because of kind of the erosion of the NCAA shields from the past, the NCAA would be in a very precarious legal position. That's the best I can say about in terms of defending the ghost transfer rule. So can I say that it's illegal or it's not, or it's legal? No, but I can say it would be subject to antitrust violation or antitrust challenge. It would be a very expensive lawsuit and very risky lawsuit for the NCAA to defend, and there's a very good chance that they would lose that lawsuit.
One important distinction, I think, for the general public: kid decide he wants to transfer, he can't just put his name in the portal. That has to be done by the compliance office at his current institution.
Yes, to a degree. Because to be in the transfer portal, yes, but to do what Xavier Lucas did and just say, well, I'm no longer enrolled at the University of Wisconsin, I'm enrolling right now at the University of Miami. Aside from this ghost transfer rule, there's no restriction on that. There's nothing the NCAA can do about that. The NCAA can't tell people they can't transfer between institutions. All they can do is either from before make them sit out a year, which they can't do because it was enjoined by a court in West Virginia, or they can, what they're trying to do now, punish the school for taking them. They can't stop a player. They can't stop a student from transferring. That's very basic right there.
Yeah. It goes back to, I'll kind of recap again, just like the things being in the shadows, the things where it's like, you've got the portal and yes, the school has to put you in that. And that more or less allows you as an athlete, some sort of confidence in that I'm putting my name here. I understand that, practically that may eliminate me from coming back to my old school because somebody may look at me and say, we're not really sure that we want you anymore based on the action you took. But it doesn't necessarily eliminate that opportunity for you to go back. And you still have the ability, once you're in the portal, for other schools, other coaches to be able to contact you, and you're able to have these conversations. If you take the Xavier Lucas path, which is what the NCAA is pushing people toward, you are unenrolling with no protection. You're unenrolling with no guarantee that you'll have anywhere to land. And so in order to feel any level of certainty to make that option, you're asking people to have these conversations in back channels and behind, closed doors. And I just that is the opposite direction of how you're going to solve this problem, in my opinion. And I understand the desire for stability. You bring up stability every week. I understand the desire for coaches and athletic directors and everybody else to understand on by a certain time of year that their roster is set and that they know how much money they've spent and that they know how much, who's going to play what and what their competition looks like and all the things that go into it. Absolutely understand the desire for that. But everything that you have done to try to challenge, this ability to create stability has impacted negatively the group of people that is most endangered in this whole situation. And I think this is just another example of it.
Well, that's probably a good spot to pivot. Because I think that was well said. New eligibility, Sam. New eligibility rules. Mm-hmm. Let's go into that. 5 for 5.
Yeah. So the new rules of the NCAA, they haven't quite, totally agreed to it yet. They're it's something the Division I Council is working on. It's something that, NCAA President Charlie Baker is very much pushing for at this point. From what they've publicly released, to my understanding, it is now 5 for 5. So there's no more redshirt years. It's no more, you have 4 seasons or you have 5 years to play 4 seasons. But you can't, that 5th season has to be a redshirt year. It's now, you have 5 seasons to play 5 seasons, or 5 years to play 5 seasons, which personally I think makes a lot more sense because, if you're talking about just in terms of now that they're making money, it's a money that, the best players who are not getting redshirted are not able to access. But that's something I'm sure we'll get into. But yeah, 5 for 5. There's now an age rule cap on this where I believe it's 23, right?
I think it's 24 because it's
24.
19. Once you turn,
yeah, 24. You're right.
Yeah, you can be as old as 19 before your 5-year clock starts. So.
Yeah. So so essentially, there's an age rule cutoff. Kind of the opposite to a certain degree of what some sports leagues, what some professional leagues have, which is something I'm sure we'll touch on. But yeah, you can once you turn 24, you're not eligible to play college sports anymore, regardless of whether you continue to have eligibility. And they've also clarified, because a lot of players, a lot of people had questions about this, justifiable questions. They've also clarified that, if you're currently enrolled, if you're currently an athlete, then, you can, whatever's more favorable to you, either the old rules or the new rules. But, athletes who are, losing their eligibility this year, even if it is a 4 seasons thing where, they haven't had access to that 5th year, they would not have access to that 5th year. So everyone who is kind of in that weird little group where, they just finished their 4th season this year, they're out of luck.
Will that get challenged?
Probably.
Will they win?
I'm not sure. Honestly, I think the biggest challenge that they're going to have is time. Because, the all the decisions I just mentioned, the Eli decision, the Furkurian decision, the Robinson decision, likely the Brown decision as well, once that comes out, have, at least if you're challenging this from an antitrust perspective, it's a much higher standard of evidence that you need. Might be collecting that evidence right now. I mean, I know Patterson's going on, this class action lawsuit that was challenging the 4 seasons and 5 years rule and kind of pushing for 5 for 5, which they're still looking for monetary relief. So the injunctive relief might go away if this gets passed, but they are in the process of collecting evidence right now. They already have a lot of evidence. They're in the middle of discovery right now. So maybe it's a situation where they're using that evidence and kind of maybe adding to this lawsuit to a certain degree, but and that would certainly help speed things along. But there is a much higher standard for evidence to show the market realities, to show the relevant market, and to show the anti-competitive harm. So it's not something necessarily where someone could just challenge it immediately and expect to be able to win.
So does the JUCO ruling have any impact on this?
It does, only from the perspective where, I mean, it does only from the perspective of, I think that's why we're here, is because of the Pavia ruling and because of all this has led here. But to my understanding, and I'm almost 99% sure about this, the new NCAA rules do not change that about JUCO. They still kind of count that towards it. And, I think the age gap makes that, inherently clear.
Yeah. Well, I think we all knew we'd get to 5 for 5 at some point when they were given 4 games. That was inevitable, regardless of NIL.
Yeah. 4 games, and then 4 games plus any playoff games, and but you didn't have the same rules for other sports. It was always very precarious and weird.
Yeah, I think you made a great point about the economic reality of it, of like the deterrence, essentially. If someone has 5 years to make the money and they're being told they can't redshirt, basically, you've lost a year of that money-making ability. And I think that I give a little bit of credit to the NCAA to just like somewhat, this is probably the most proactive they've been about a rule of that nature, to just say, all right, yep, that makes sense. We're going to move on from that and not worry about the court decision there. This rule is expected to go into effect this coming fall, which is very fast for really any NCAA rule, especially of this magnitude, where you've got years and years of people that are going to be affected. We've mentioned the class that will be most affected, which they're being told, sorry, you just got caught in the middle.
Feel bad for those kids.
I do too. I understand though, like someone's going to have to be that first class that didn't get to take advantage to a certain degree. And so it's hard. I don't know how you're supposed to, you put the rule in place and then you say, well, this is going to take effect 3 years from now or something. And you give everybody the chance to do it. In the meantime, you just get challenged on it. Like, why isn't it happening now? So someone was always going to get caught in the middle on that. I think it's tough. I'm curious, as we've talked through it, age restriction, years out of high school restriction. We talked in our eligibility episode a few weeks back. You had brought up, and I know there were caveats and disclaimers abound, but you had brought up the idea that potentially it would be permissible and defensible if this was built around academics. Do you feel like this is in that same vein? It's not decidedly about academics. Do you still feel like this is also defensible in that way, or did they not go far enough?
Whether it's defensible or not, I'm not sure.
Okay.
Whether it's in the vein of academics, I would say no.
Yeah.
I'll point out that age rules, just having an age restriction itself, is not necessarily defensible. We saw the Maurice Claret decision back in 2004, where again, the NFL ended up winning, but only because it was part of the collective bargaining agreement, or the Second Circuit felt that it was. I very much disagree, but that's a subject for 22 years ago. The district court had originally found that the NFL's, you have to be 3 years out of high school rule was an antitrust violation. And one that I actually, at the time forgot to mention, but I'll mention it now. Much more recently, we had it with the NWSL, the National Women's Soccer League. They had an age rule as well where you had to be 18. Olivia Moultrie challenged it and won, and she was able to start playing for the Portland Thorns. I think she was 16 at the time. She's a really good player. She deserved to be there, but the age rule was kind of keeping her out. So we've seen challenges to age rules before, and and kind of the opposite perspective. And here it might be more defensible because, you know, it, at least to a certain degree, is tied to academics to a perspective where you're like, okay, well, even if we're not going to restrict it to, you know, a certain amount of academic years where it's like you have your freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior year, we're still saying, well, we're looking at kind of the traditional kind of, you know, academic lifespan of a college student, and they're usually out by 24, but also ignores the reality of college. I mean, I'm a college professor, and I have students who are, you know, oftentimes older than me in my classes because we have non-traditional students. We have students who are, whoa.
I think we need to leave.
Is this a test?
We'll be right back.
All right. Well, false alarm that interrupted where we were at. But Sam remembers what we were talking about. We were talking about non-traditional students. So let's just go right back into it.
Yeah, Mike had asked me before the fire alarm, which ended up being a false alarm, thankfully. Mike was asking me about like you know, this new age rule that they're having with the eligibility rule. You know, the 24-year-old max, and whether that kind of is more defensible because it plausibly fits within kind of the academic life cycle. And I was saying to a certain degree, maybe, but also, you know, we also have non-traditional students. Like I'm a professor, and you know, I have students in my class all the time who are not of that traditional academic profile, who are older, who are oftentimes older than I am. And that's great. That's awesome. And, you know, well, I mean, if you're older than I am, you're probably not playing college sports, but even older than 24, like, you know, we've seen all these stories of players being able to play college sports at that quote unquote older age. And those have been really great stories. Like I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but the offensive lineman who ended up playing for the Steelers, who was a firefighter before he went into college sports. And we're going to be losing a lot of those stories. And we also have, you know, isolated, you know, other kind of situations where I think a lot of people are still very much have questions about, because we don't have the full extent of these rules yet. Like, what about, you know, schools who, you know, very often, you know, recruit Mormon players who sit out for missions before starting college? Or what about athletes who have, you know, medical incidents where it causes them to miss a couple years before they're able to play college? I know hockey coaches, for example, are really upset about this because just the way that hockey works, the way that college hockey works, it does not really work with this. And you know, because, you know, they're playing in junior leagues first, and then they're coming to college, and then, you know, they're drafted, but the team retains the rights while they're in college, and that's okay for hockey, but it's not okay for other sports. It's this very weird kind of situation, and I think this goes to something we were just talking about while we were waiting on the fire alarm, which is that, you know, the NCAA always tries to have these very one-size-fits-all type of policies, and it doesn't really work necessarily.
Yeah, completely agree. I'm curious on this 5-for-5 component, especially with how fast they're trying to jam it through. You mentioned you don't know how defensible it is. We presume it's going to get challenged. How fast is it going to get challenged? What is this going to lead to when they're trying to initiate this rule in 3 months? What is that? How does it play out?
Yeah. And I think, you know, it's something, you know, we were talking a little bit about this before the break as well. The recent challenges that we've had, you know, the way the Court of Appeals have ruled is going to make it very difficult to have a quick challenge. If they fold into Patterson, though, anything goes, because Patterson's already collecting this discovery. They've already received a lot of this evidence. They've been able to do more to kind of formulate their case already, to be able to define this relevant market. But I already imagine, like, if we need kind of expert economics, you know, economists like, you know, Joel Maxey, who's been, you know, a favorite in a lot of these cases, to define this new relevant market and to provide evidence of this new relevant market, which is what the Court of Appeals are asking for now. I imagine those processes are already underway, not only to challenge this new rule, but also to challenge the old rules as well. I imagine a lot of the groundwork is already being laid by plaintiffs' attorneys, especially given that we have a very wide class here, and something we didn't even mention about this. The class of athletes who are kind of getting screwed over in this is that, you know, they have extra motivation to be upset about this, because the way that the timing worked out, and this has nothing to do with the 5-for-5, but they're kind of in that perfect storm where they're not getting the benefit of the new 5-for-5 rule because they entered school before that, but they're also not getting the benefit. They also didn't get the benefit of the COVID year because they enrolled in college after that. So kind of, really, really tough situation for them.
Yeah, I feel bad for them. I really do. But I mean, I get it. Like all of a sudden,
you have to start somewhere.
Yeah, and all of a sudden, if there's this giant group of student athletes that are now all of a sudden given an extra year and rosters are already set, like, is that going to take opportunities away from kids that thought they had them?
Right.
Are you going to give relief to roster cap limits? There's a lot at play there, and I get it. I'm more interested right now, probably in what we're going to start calling the years of eligibility. Like, are we forever done with the word red shirt?
You would think. I mean, it's part of the reason that it's going away.
Maybe we have like practical red shirts where it's like, well, we're red shirting a year. It's still going to count towards their years of eligibility. It's not something special under the rules, but he's going to be sitting out for development reasons, and that's not really necessarily the same kind of red shirt year, but maybe just kind of practical
year. Yeah, I worked in media relations and I'm a nerd, so I want to know if we're done with the term red shirt or if everybody's going to have to call them fifth-year seniors, but nobody that's listening to this probably cares about that. Switching gears once again, the new tennis rules, Sam, about what you're able to recoup and what you're not able to recoup. There was some movement on that this week.
Yeah, and this is another situation, like Mike pointed out, where the NCAA is being proactive about this. So they've actually done several times over the past several decades is, they're faced with this lawsuit. They're like, this one probably isn't worth defending, or, is something where it could be absolutely catastrophic if we do try to defend and we lose, which led to the House settlement. Yeah. This is now the Brantmeier settlement. Reese Brantmeier and Maya Joint, two tennis players. Brantmeier at University of North Carolina, Joint was originally going to play for the University of Texas, did not end up playing for the University of Texas, but they had sued the NCAA a couple of years ago, and it was a lawsuit that I think flew way under the radar because it was one that was absolutely fascinating just in terms of what it challenged and how it challenged, because it was going after rules that said that college athletes cannot receive prize money for outside competitions while they're either before they enroll in a college or during their college eligibility. So a player like, Maya Joint, who is a, nationally recognized tennis player, Reese Brantmeier, a nationally recognized tennis player, they have opportunities beyond playing at UNC and Texas to play in the U.S. Open, for example, and receive prize money for the U.S. Open. But Brantmeier, for example, she had played in the U.S. Open, and she was only able to receive necessary and reasonable expenses. And her complaint goes through she was told she was only able to recoup, or she was only able to receive half the cost of her hotel room because her mom stayed in the hotel room with her, and like a scanner that she bought to keep track of the receipts was not able to be something that she'd be able to get paid for. It was just kind of this mess. But she and her lawsuit made this comparison and made this kind of like hands in the air kind of thing, where it's like, you look at the House settlement, you look at NIL, and it was before the House settlement, but you look at NIL, and football players and basketball players and players across the spectrum are able to receive money now. Why are we still doing this? Why are we still trying to defend this lawsuit? And eventually I think the NCAA agreed, where it's like, this is not worth defending. It's something where if we get a court decision against this, it could really hurt us in other cases. It would be precedent that players could rely on in other cases. We're going to settle this lawsuit. And they did so, by my understanding, by my read, they're kind of actually splitting the difference, where they're saying you can have participated in outside competitions prior to enrollment, but while you're enrolled as a college student, you cannot. It still has to be limited to necessary and reasonable expenses. I think that phrasing might be off a little bit, but
actual and necessary expenses.
Actual and necessary. I knew there's a word I was missing there, but yeah, that's what they're going for with this new settlement, with this new rule scope.
Well, good for them for taking the step, but just rip the Band-Aid off now. Like, yeah, they're able to compete in tournaments in the summer too, while they're in college. Like,
right.
That's going to fall eventually as well. Why not just do it now?
I don't know.
Is this where you want to shout at clouds?
No. We're past that point.
Okay.
I made it. The fire alarm helped, and yeah, we're in good shape there.
Okay. Well,
but I don't get this one either.
I just, we all know where it's going to go. Why stop it once they enroll?
I mean, to play devil's advocate, it certainly aligns with the same theory that schools can't pay them for participating in athletics. And you want to keep this narrow scope of like, well, while you're under our control, while you're earning these benefits from the university in exchange for definitely not for playing sports, like you definitely shouldn't be making prize money for playing sports, because if we can't pay you for your athletic ability, you really shouldn't make money for your athletic ability somewhere else. I don't know that there's a better definition or explanation for what they're trying to accomplish, but that's going to fall too. So I don't know. Maybe they're just waiting for those things all to go together.
A domino for another day.
And at some point when schools are explicitly paying, football players and basketball players for their ability to play their sport, then this rule also changes where people are able to do it. But I mean, I think they do have a little bit of leverage in that it's like, well, if you're so good and you're making so much money, just go. Like, you don't need to play college tennis. Just go do it. Oh, the opportunity isn't quite that good for you, so you want to double dip? Like, well, this is how you can play in college. And that has some weight, and I get it, but the earning years are still limited. And so we kind of talk about the economic reality, and we've talked about it so many times. Your earning years are limited. And is that really what the NCAA wants to define? Is that really what they want to say? This is our scope. We're not going to bend on it. Like, I don't know. What's the issue with Reese Brantmeyer being able to compete at the highest level and be on the same plane as everybody else, and also get to play college tennis because she's within, the 19 to 24 age limit and she hasn't played for 5 years yet. I don't see an issue with it. I think it's a little bit crazy that they went to the lengths they went to on the settlement and then did stop that short and left themselves exposed for yet another challenge. But I can see why they still want to kind of, fight the fight, I guess.
Yeah, honestly, I'm actually more surprised that Milberg, Brantmeyer's attorneys would actually agree to this, but I'm sure they have, other motivations here.
They get to sue again.
What's that?
They get to have another class.
Yeah. Well, it depends on how it's framed. I mean, I guess the proposed settlement agreement is out now, so I should probably look into that. But haven't had a chance to read it yet. It's finals week, but but it might have a similar kind of release situation as the House settlement, where it kind of goes beyond kind of this individual class, but might be more difficult to defend than the House settlement. The House settlement was kind of its own kind of special little animal, but I mean, we have kind of that rubric now, that kind of rubric that kind of basis down. So maybe it does that. I don't know. I'll have to report back next episode, but yeah, like I also think that looking at the plaintiff's attorney's point of view, they're also getting $2 million in damages for this. Brantmeyer and Jointer each getting $10K, and they're splitting the rest among the other kind of high individual, or they're getting an extra $10K, I should say, because they're also part of the class. They're distributing that $2 million among other kind of high ranking tennis players who have not been able to do this, and the plaintiffs' attorneys are definitely getting a pretty high cut of that as well. So
one of my questions before we get to our unilateral decision, one of my questions is, a lot of these kids had to give money back. Like if they earned, over whatever that cap was, they had to give money. Can they now go recoup that money that they gave back?
Well, that's what the $2 million is for.
That's coming from the NCAA, right? Like
yes.
The money that they were earning prior, they didn't give to the NCAA.
No.
So whoever they had to give it back to, can they go get that?
Nope. Not that I'm aware of, at least.
Sucks for them.
Yeah.
Well,
that's great for the U.S. Open, I guess.
Yeah. Well, okay. Unilateral decision time on this vein. Where do you draw the line on earnings for student athletes based on this Brantmeyer decision? Case, whatever you want to call it. Where do you draw the line on earnings potential for student athletes?
Specifically outside competition?
Specifically outside competition.
I think if it's one of those things where you're, kind of adding additional kind of incentive to enroll at a particular school, then that might be still be something that's defensible. But the idea, and I know people are not going to be happy about this, but the idea of the amateur athlete is for the most part. At least at the Division I level, it's not a thing anymore. Having them compete in outside competitions is perfectly fine, in my opinion. I don't see any real reason to continue defending kind of the sort of thing. I think you're very much trying to defend a system that just doesn't exist anymore. So I don't see a reason to have kind of the restrictions that the Brantmeyer settlement keeps in place, and just in general, yeah. I don't know what kind of line it is, because these are professional athletes now, and they have been professional athletes. A lot of the times in these cases, especially we're looking at basketball, for example, and we're recruiting athletes who have been playing professionally overseas and having them come and play quasi-professionally here in the United States, and it's the exact same situation. It really is. They got paid to play before, and they're going to get paid to play after, and in the middle, they're getting paid for play. We're just not calling it that. So I don't see why you have, and maybe this is hypocritical given what I just said before about, these one size fits all rules, but I don't know why you have a separate, playbook for tennis than you do for basketball or any other sport.
Yeah, I mean, I think of some of the sillier examples that we can all remember from, having worked in college athletics and being around it, especially when it was really being pushed on some of these things. I mean, we had, there's a really well-known outdoor 3-on-3 basketball tournament that gets played in Spokane every year, Hoop Fest. And for years, college athletes couldn't compete in like the elite division of that. And why? Because they might win a t-shirt when the thing's over. Like, it just, a lot of that stuff makes no sense. I think there's plenty of reasons that somebody could say, I don't really want you to play in it because I'm invested in you, and that's the potential for you to incur another injury. So there's a whole different argument about whether or not, schools should have the right to be able to say which outside competition they compete in. But it almost kind of felt like a scapegoat in a lot of ways to be like, hey, the coaches don't really want them playing in these things, but I don't want the coaches to have to be the ones to tell them they can't. So how do we find a way? It's like, oh, well, there's a t-shirt available. Oh yeah, strike that down. Like that's a prize. So I think that starts to go away a little bit, and you're going to have harder conversations. It goes back to contracting with the athletes. Like, what's in the contract? You've got, plenty of agreements with professional athletes that say they can't ride jet skis or they can't go skiing or whatever. Like,
which is totally fine.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So let's get closer to that. And I think that solves some of the issue. And then the amateurism piece. Yeah, I completely agree with Sam. I don't need to belabor that again. We've talked about it a number of times that's just not the thing to hold on to anymore. That's not the thing that is going to differentiate college athletics moving forward. It probably hasn't been for a while, and so let's just move on from that. But I think that Sam mentioned a good nugget there as far as like if there's an inducement element, if there's something that makes it more enticing for somebody to go to a certain school. We've seen situations where a sport team at a specific school, maybe is like the U.S. Pan American team, or is like the team that represents in the World Games or something like that, where if that's the situation and there's prize money involved, yeah, that's a reason for somebody to go to that school that another school can't compete with. And I think that's something you should certainly, eliminate and move to eliminate or rule against. But I think the word competition, as long as there is fair competition involved in everything, I really don't see any reason. I mean, we think about like some, maybe in a certain local market, there's a booster group that wants to put on this really big tournament, and they really want to make sure that this group of athletes competes in that tournament because wink, wink, nudge, nudge, the prize pool is really big. And guess what? I've stacked the deck and you're going to win this tournament. Okay, I mean, you can't make rules against every little possible thing that somebody's going to do, but certainly there's a way to say, well, did you win the thing fair and square? Okay, let's just call it an NIL deal. Like, let's just say that the prize money was because the group putting on the event really wanted this group to be there. They paid them for an endorsement deal. They got them there. So be it. Like, I just don't think that it's worth going down the road to try to, line item out every possible thing that could be a problem. But Sam brought up a good point about if that school and that team is like the competition group, and the fact that you go there gives you this opportunity to then possibly win a tournament or win something that is not available to you elsewhere because you couldn't be selected for that team or you couldn't make it into that tournament. You couldn't, register because you weren't part of that team. I think that inducement piece is something that's worth monitoring and making sure is still enforceable. But the rest of it, I think a lot of it comes down more to the contracts of like, what does your school want to allow you to participate in outside of your school competition, not for reasons that are economic, but for reasons of injury, their investment, your time, all those sorts of things.
Or even economic, honestly. Like, I think where I come down, and this is already something we've touched on a few times in this, so maybe a good place to, kind of, put a bow on it. But when you have one school, when you have one team that's saying, we want to pay for your exclusive rights and we don't want you to compete during the summer, we don't want you to play for another team over the summer, that's fine. That's something you can do in individual contracts. That's absolutely doable. But when you have the entire NCAA doing it, where it's like if you're playing college sports, you can't play for anyone else because we want the only ability, or we want the only the only entity to make money off of you while while you're in college is to be us. That starts to look more like an exclusionary boycott, and that's where antitrust law gets involved.
Well, it seems to me, this is probably where I'll come down, is whether it's pay for play or not, you're signing athletes to contracts with monetary values associated with them because you think they're going to bring value to your institution. So to allow them to go out and play in these outside competitions and make more money for themselves through sponsorships and other things, but to have success, that's something you as an institution are going to point to and promote. I mean, you're going to be following them. And if you got a kid playing in the US Open, I mean, you're having watch parties at your school. I mean, that's bringing value. So I say rip the Band-Aid off and don't stop it when they enroll at your institution. Let them go. Because now I get it, like to what you said and what you touched on, if you don't want them competing, for risk of injury, that you can put that in your contract. But when they're evaluating where they're going to go and they're evaluating contracts, if over here this school is telling you that we don't want you to play in outside competitions and we're going to prohibit you from having an opportunity to make money, and this school's not,
and school's celebrating it,
that contract is probably going to have a higher monetary value because you're not going to allow them to go do that on the outside, but this one's going to let you to compete in whatever you want. That's going to be a part of your recruiting process.
Sure.
That's going to be up to the kid to make the decision. If they chose this and I'm not going to go do this, that's fine. And
that's exactly why the schools don't want to have to make the decision themselves.
No, 100%. But you're going to promote it. You're going to point to it. It's going to bring value to the institution. I say rip the Band-Aid off and let them go compete wherever the hell they want. So, and it doesn't matter what amateurism says because, as we've talked about, it's college sports now. It's not amateurism. Mike's talked about this before. Let's redesign the whole model and let's just call it college sports. So, I don't know. If you guys don't have anything else to add,
no fire drills.
No more fire drills. That'll do it for this episode of Unilateral Decisions. Maybe there will be somebody else sitting in this chair next week. Maybe not. So, all right, y'all.